Imagine the moment when the ground shakes beneath your feet, the lights go out, and the familiar glow of connection disappears all at once. In disasters, silence is not peace, it is danger. Because when communication collapses, hope often follows. This is where the story truly begins, not in a laboratory or a boardroom, but in the fragile seconds after an earthquake, during the confusion of war, or amid rising floodwaters, when people reach for help and find nothing. Connectivity becomes oxygen, and without it, rescue slows, coordination fails, and lives hang in the balance. For decades, the world accepted that communication would return slowly, piece by fragile piece, once towers were rebuilt and cables were repaired. But today, that assumption is being challenged by a quiet revolution in the sky. Starlink represents more than fast internet or modern convenience. It represents a shift in how humanity responds to crisis. When earthquakes fracture cities and wars sever infrastructure, traditional networks are often the first to fall. Fiber lines snap, cell towers collapse, and power grids fail, leaving entire regions isolated. In these moments, waiting days or weeks for restoration is not just inconvenient, it is catastrophic. Starlink enters this space with a different philosophy, one built on speed, resilience, and independence from the ground below. Because its satellites orbit above the chaos, they remain untouched by rubble, fire, or flood. And because the system relies on compact terminals, it can be activated in hours rather than weeks. In disaster zones, time is the most precious resource. Emergency teams do not have the luxury of long installations or complex repairs. A single Starlink terminal can be transported by vehicle, aircraft, or even carried by hand into areas where roads no longer exist. Once powered, it reconnects hospitals, command centers, and shelters to the outside world almost instantly. This ability to leap over destroyed infrastructure changes everything. Doctors can consult specialists remotely. Governments can coordinate relief, and families can send messages that confirm survival. These moments may seem small, but in crisis, they define humanity. This approach reflects a broader vision often associated with Elon Musk, a belief that technology should solve real problems at scale, especially when stakes are highest. While Starlink is frequently discussed as a commercial service, its true value reveals itself under pressure, when conventional systems fail and alternatives are scarce. After earthquakes, Starlink has enabled emergency responders to map damage in real time. During conflicts, it has supported communication where networks were deliberately disrupted. After floods, it has restored access to information for communities cut off from the world. Each deployment reinforces the same lesson, that resilience matters more than perfection. Yet the story does not unfold without tension. As disasters grow more frequent and complex, the question is no longer whether communication is essential, but whether society is prepared to prioritize it as infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and power lines are recognized as necessities, but connectivity is still too often treated as optional. This mindset creates a dangerous gap, one that only becomes visible when systems collapse. In the quiet aftermath of disaster, when the news cameras leave and rebuilding begins, the absence of reliable communication slows recovery and deepens trauma. The suspense lies in whether humanity will adapt before the next crisis arrives. Starlink challenges this hesitation by proving that rapid connectivity is possible anywhere, under almost any condition. It removes the dependency on local terrain and fragile installations, offering a model where communication can be deployed proactively rather than reactively. This is not about replacing traditional networks, but about complementing them with a safety net that activates when everything else fails. The presence of such a system forces a re-evaluation of priorities, asking whether preparedness should include space-based solutions as standard equipment. As we stand at this crossroads, the meaning of technology shifts. It is no longer measured only by speed tests or monthly subscriptions, but by its ability to preserve order in chaos. Starlink's role in disaster zones reveals a future where connectivity is treated as a human need, embedded into emergency planning and global response strategies. The question lingering beneath this progress is not how impressive the technology is, but how willing we are to recognize its necessity before the next disaster tests us again. This realization demands a change in mindset from leaders, institutions, and individuals alike, urging them to plan for connection before calamity strikes. When emergency kits include communication alongside food and water, resilience becomes intentional rather than accidental. Starlink illustrates how preparation can compress response time and expand reach, turning isolation into coordination. As the world watches disasters unfold in real time, the systems that restore connection first often shape outcomes. The future hinted here is uncomfortable yet hopeful, suggesting that survival increasingly depends on foresight, cooperation, and tools designed for extremes. Whether this lesson is fully learned remains uncertain, but its urgency grows with every tremor, siren, and rising tide, pressing humanity to decide what it values most when everything else is stripped away. This moment invites reflection, reminding us that progress is measured not only by innovation, but by compassion applied at scale, where technology stands ready to serve the vulnerable, protect responders, and restore dignity, proving that connection, when preserved, can become the quiet force that carries societies forward through darkness together beyond fear, rebuilding hope, trust, purpose, and shared responsibility for tomorrow globally onward. As the story moves deeper, a subtle tension begins to form, because the promise of instant connectivity collides with the reality of an increasingly unstable world. Disasters are no longer rare interruptions. They are becoming a pattern, testing systems again and again until their weaknesses are impossible to ignore. Traditional communication networks were designed for stability, not for collapse. They assume intact roads, steady power, and predictable maintenance cycles, assumptions that crumble the moment nature or conflict intervenes. In that fragile gap between expectation and reality, communities are left waiting, listening for signals that never arrive. This is where the true importance of Starlink becomes clearer, not as a futuristic luxury, but as a response to a world that no longer behaves predictably. In the aftermath of a major disaster, the first hours define everything. Decisions made without information are guesses, and guesses cost lives. Emergency coordinators need maps, weather data, and real-time updates. Hospitals need patient records, supply chains, and communication with specialists. Families need reassurance that loved ones are alive. When all of this depends on damaged ground infrastructure, delay becomes inevitable. Starlink bypasses that delay by existing above it. Its satellites continue moving, unaffected by collapsed bridges or submerged cables, offering a continuity that ground-based systems cannot guarantee. This difference creates a quiet but profound shift in outcomes, turning isolation into coordination and confusion into strategy. Yet reliance on space-based connectivity introduces its own questions, and this is where suspense quietly builds. Can a system designed for global coverage truly serve the most remote, chaotic environments? Can it scale fast enough when multiple disasters strike at once? These questions linger as Starlink deployments multiply, revealing both strength and responsibility. Each successful activation raises expectations, and with expectations comes pressure. The more the world depends on such systems, the more critical it becomes that they perform under stress. This tension is not a flaw, but a sign of transition, as society begins to place life-critical trust in technology that operates beyond the horizon. The philosophy behind this transition echoes ideas often associated with Elon Musk, particularly the belief that bold solutions are necessary when incremental fixes fail. Instead of reinforcing fragile systems again and again, Starlink represents a parallel layer, a backup designed not for comfort, but for survival. In war zones where communication is deliberately disrupted, Starlink has maintained channels that support coordination and information flow. In flood-stricken regions where roads vanish underwater, it has allowed authorities to assess damage and deploy aid effectively. These examples highlight a pattern, showing that when infrastructure collapses, resilience must come from somewhere else. Still, the emotional weight of these moments cannot be ignored. Behind every deployment are people experiencing loss, fear, and uncertainty. Technology alone does not heal trauma, but it can create the conditions for recovery. When communication returns, even briefly, it restores a sense of agency. People can ask for help, share their stories, and reconnect with the wider world. This psychological impact is often overlooked, yet it plays a crucial role in how communities endure and rebuild. Starlink's ability to restore connection quickly transforms despair into action, reminding people that they are not forgotten. As this realization spreads, the narrative shifts from reaction to preparation. Governments, humanitarian organizations, and emergency planners begin to reconsider how they allocate resources. Instead of viewing satellite connectivity as an optional enhancement, it starts to resemble essential equipment, like generators or medical supplies. This shift challenges long-standing assumptions about cost, priority, and responsibility. Investing in preparedness often feels abstract until disaster strikes, but the evidence accumulates with each deployment, making the case harder to ignore. The suspense lies in whether this evidence will be acted upon widely, or whether lessons will once again be learned too late. The middle of this story is not about triumph, but about choice. Humanity stands between two paths, one that continues relying solely on vulnerable systems, and another that embraces redundancy and resilience. Starlink symbolizes the second path, offering a way to ensure that when one system fails, another stands ready. This is not a promise of perfection, but a commitment to reduce suffering when chaos is unavoidable. The tension remains unresolved, because the future depends on decisions being made now, before the next siren sounds or the next shoreline disappears. In this unfolding chapter, technology becomes a mirror reflecting values. If connectivity is treated as essential, then systems like Starlink will be integrated into emergency planning worldwide. If it remains categorized as a luxury, then its potential will be underused and its benefits delayed until desperation forces action. The suspense tightens around this question, asking whether society will recognize the warning signs written into recent history. Disasters are accelerating, and with them, the demand for instant, reliable communication. The systems that answer that demand will shape not just response times, but trust, stability, and survival. As the world watches these patterns repeat, the meaning of preparedness evolves. It is no longer enough to rebuild what was lost. Resilience requires anticipating failure and designing around it. Starlink's growing presence in disaster response illustrates how foresight can change outcomes, compressing the distance between need and help. This chapter closes not with certainty, but with urgency, underscoring that the real test is not technological capability, but collective willingness to adapt. The clock continues to move, disasters continue to strike, and the question of readiness grows louder with each passing moment, pressing humanity toward a decision it can no longer afford to postpone. The final movement of this story brings clarity, because when patterns repeat often enough, they begin to teach unmistakable lessons. Across continents and cultures, disasters have exposed the same vulnerability again and again, showing that communication is the thread holding response, recovery, and resilience together. When that thread snaps, everything else unravels faster. Starlink's growing role in disaster zones does not arrive as a miracle, but as a response shaped by reality, one that acknowledges failure as inevitable and designs around it. This perspective changes how society measures progress, shifting focus from convenience to continuity, from novelty to necessity. In moments when the world feels fractured, the ability to reconnect becomes a form of power. Not power in the sense of control, but power as capability, the capacity to act instead of waiting helplessly. When emergency teams regain access to data, they move with confidence. When hospitals reconnect, treatment becomes coordinated rather than improvised. When civilians can send messages, panic gives way to clarity. These outcomes may appear technical, yet they are deeply human, rooted in the simple need to be seen, heard, and helped. Starlink enables these connections by operating where chaos dominates, turning the unreachable into the reachable. This transformation invites a broader philosophical reflection on responsibility. Technology often advances faster than the systems meant to use it wisely, creating gaps between what is possible and what is prioritized. Starlink challenges this gap by demonstrating that preparedness is no longer limited by geography. Remote villages, isolated islands, and conflict-ridden regions can all access the same communication backbone, provided the will exists to deploy it. This universality reframes the conversation around equity, suggesting that access to communication during emergencies should not depend on location or wealth, but on collective commitment. The vision often associated with Elon Musk emphasizes building for extremes, designing systems not just for ideal conditions, but for failure scenarios where resilience matters most. Starlink embodies this philosophy by assuming disruption as a baseline rather than an exception. In doing so, it pushes institutions to reconsider their definitions of infrastructure. Roads and bridges connect places physically, but communication connects people operationally, emotionally, and strategically. When communication holds, recovery accelerates. When it fails, everything slows. This realization elevates connectivity from a service to a safeguard. As disasters intensify under the pressures of climate change and geopolitical instability, the cost of inaction becomes clearer. Waiting for systems to collapse before responding wastes time that victims do not have. Proactive integration of satellite connectivity into emergency planning represents a shift toward foresight. It signals acceptance that the future will test systems more harshly than the past. This acceptance is uncomfortable, yet necessary, because denial offers no protection. Starlink's presence in disaster response illustrates how preparation can soften the impact of events that cannot be prevented. There is also a quiet cultural shift unfolding. As people witness connectivity restored in the most desperate circumstances, expectations change. Communities begin to ask why communication was ever treated as optional. This questioning pressures leaders and organizations to adapt, to allocate resources differently, and to invest in resilience rather than repair alone. The narrative evolves from reaction to responsibility, emphasizing that readiness is an ethical choice. When technology exists that can reduce suffering, ignoring it becomes a decision with consequences. In this light, Starlink is not the end of the story, but a chapter in a larger evolution. It represents how humanity can leverage space-based solutions to solve grounded problems. The satellites overhead remind us that perspective matters, that sometimes solutions require stepping above immediate constraints. This does not diminish the value of traditional networks, but complements them, creating layered systems that fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. Such layering reflects maturity, acknowledging that no single system is invincible, but together they can form something stronger. The ultimate message emerging from this journey is one of choice and alignment. Technology reflects priorities, and priorities shape outcomes. If society chooses to view Starlink as emergency infrastructure rather than luxury technology, its integration will save time, resources, and lives. If it remains on the margins, its potential will surface only in crisis, when urgency replaces planning. The difference between these paths lies not in innovation, but in intention. As this reflection settles, the call is not to admire technology from a distance, but to understand its role in shaping resilience. Starlink's deployments in earthquakes, wars, and floods reveal a future where connection persists even when the ground gives way. This future is neither guaranteed nor automatic. It depends on awareness, preparation, and action taken before disaster strikes. In recognizing connectivity as a lifeline, humanity affirms a simple truth, that staying connected is not about speed or status, but about survival and solidarity. The sky above becomes a symbol of readiness, reminding us that solutions exist when imagination meets responsibility, and that progress measured in lives protected carries meaning beyond numbers. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.